I'm going to sign all your waivers, and then do not contact me until 2027. Wow. Okay, that right there, that's a real, incredibly tense excerpt from a phone call between an Indiana mother, Megan Pearson, and a Department of Child Services worker. It's raw, you know? It's just utterly exhausted. And it absolutely nails that intense friction that sparks when a deeply personal family crisis collides head-on with rigid government bureaucracy. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tackling the really fascinating and honestly often misunderstood legal systems behind government child welfare actions. What we're going to do is unpack the exact policies, the digital databases, and the actual mathematical thresholds that dictate when a state decides to step into a family's life and when it decides to step back. It's a complex web for sure, but we are going to make it crystal clear. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap. We'll start inside Indiana's child welfare mandate, explore the assessment data gateway, and then break down the evidence thresholds. After that, we'll ground all of this in a real case study of the Pearson family before examining what's called the systemic supervision gap. Section 1. Inside Indiana's child welfare, Indiana's legal mandate. When we look at the foundational legal mandate for child safety here, the specific language Indiana uses is actually super fascinating. Under Indiana Code 31-9-2-9.6, they deliberately shifted away from calling them CPS investigations. It's no longer this punitive model focused purely on finding fault or pointing fingers. Instead, they conduct DCS assessments. And that's a key distinction. It's meant to be a service-oriented evaluation. The whole goal is to look at the underlying causes of safety issues, evaluate what functional strengths the family actually has, and figure out what supports, formal or informal, are needed to keep the child safely at home. Honestly, it's a subtle but massive philosophical shift in how the state approaches families in crisis. Section 2. The Assessment Data Gateway, Tracking Assessments. So how exactly does the state securely track all of these assessments across thousands of families? Well, if your family interacts with child services in Indiana, your information goes into a system called MAGIC. To demystify that acronym a bit, it stands for the Management Gateway for Indiana's Kids. MAGIC is this massive, federally compliant electronic database. Think of it as the primary repository for the entire life cycle of a child welfare case. Literally every interview, every contact log from a caseworker, vendor payments, risk assessments, it all lives right here in this digital vault. It's highly secure, too. I mean, unauthorized access by a state employee is a fireable and sometimes even criminal offense. The culmination of every single assessment logged into MAGIC is something formally called the 311 report. This report has strict, mandatory components. Caseworkers have got to fill out the summary, the scope, the safety assessment, and the conclusion statement. But here is the really fascinating procedural requirement. Policy dictates that caseworkers absolutely must use behavior-based nouns and verbs rather than value judgments. So they can't just write down, the parent was acting irrationally. Nope. They have to objectively document specific observable actions. Because this report becomes the official record used in court cases and appeals, maintaining total objectivity is just absolutely crucial. Section 3. The Evidence Thresholds, Legal Classifications. But how do caseworkers objectively decide the final outcome of that 311 report? This is where the legal rubber really meets the road. They have to classify their findings. Now, a substantiated finding means there is a preponderance of evidence. Mathematically speaking, that's a greater than 50% probability, p is greater than 0.5, that abuse or neglect occurred. If substantiated, that person gets entered into the state's Child Protection Index. So the crucial point here is understanding the alternative, unsubstantiated. An unsubstantiated finding does not mean the allegations were totally false or made up. It simply means the state couldn't prove the allegations to that specific legal preponderance standard. And here's something a lot of folks don't realize. An unsubstantiated record doesn't just poof disappear. It's actually kept internally in the MAGIC database for 24 years after the birth of the youngest child, just sitting there as historical context for any future assessments. Section 4. Case Study. The Pearsons, A Family's Experience. To really grasp how these bureaucratic thresholds impact actual human lives, we're going to impartially observe a real case. To ground us in reality, we have the official civil court e-filings documenting the Pearson family's involvement in the legal system, specifically around a protection from abuse order. This isn't just some abstract theory we're talking about. This is heavy, administrative paperwork that reflects a very real domestic conflict involving a mother, Megan, a father, Charles, and their young kids. It really highlights the sheer volume of legal administration that families have to navigate when they're in the middle of a crisis. Let's map out how this builds over time because it reveals a really clear pattern. In September 2024, the family goes through their first DCS assessment. Just a few months later, in May 2025, there's a second DCS assessment. Then, by September 2025, the civil court steps in and grants Meghan a formal order for protection against Charles, and that order doesn't expire until July 2027. So what we're seeing here is a clear pattern of state and legal involvement escalating pretty significantly over just a one-year period. And the human toll of navigating that timeline is profound. During a recorded phone call with a DCS worker about a new assessment, Meghan expressed deep frustration. She said, "I wanted the help, and I followed every safety plan you gave me. What you did was made me pick my husband or my kids, and they didn't follow through with helping us." You can just hear the raw emotion and the exhaustion there. She feels like she played by the agency's rules, she navigated the system, but those administrative thresholds ultimately left her family without the decisive, lasting intervention she felt they so desperately needed to be safe. Let's take an impartial look at the facts of those two DCS assessments to understand exactly why she felt that way. In Assessment 1, there were allegations of neglect, plus reports of neighbors literally having to physically break up fights between the parents. However, the official finding was unsubstantiated because the children were directly observed to be clean, healthy, and physically unharmed. The strict legal threshold for state intervention just wasn't met. Then we get to Assessment 2. Here, there were clear allegations of domestic violence exposure. The caseworker literally observed a visible goose egg injury right on Meghan's forehead, and Charles even admitted to what he called micro-violence, like covering her mouth with force during arguments. Yet, remarkably, this too was unsubstantiated. The case was closed out with a voluntary referral to community partners. Because the kids weren't directly, physically harmed, and the non-offending parent was deemed capable of making safety plans, the agency's legal threshold for forced intervention was once again not crossed. Section 5. The systemic supervision gap, a systemic flaw. Now, this dynamic, it is definitely not unique to the Pearsons. Zooming back out to the macro level for a second, I want to hit you with a single startling statistic. 15%. Indiana completes more child protection assessments than almost any other state in the entire country, yet they only substantiate approximately 15% of them. Let that sink in. That means there is a massive volume of families coming into contact with the child welfare system, but an incredibly small fraction actually end up crossing that legal threshold for state action. This resulting systemic flaw is what analysts call the supervision gap. It's like the front door of the child welfare system is just wide open. Literally, anyone with a suspicion can call the reporting hotline. But then you hit that strict evidentiary bottleneck we just talked about, and it leaves families in high-conflict situations just kind of floating in a void. When violence between adults is admitted but the children aren't directly, physically harmed, cases often default to unsubstantiated. These families clearly need structural help, but they fall just short of qualifying for formal court-monitored oversight. So how on earth do we bridge this dangerous gap? Well, the data points strongly toward environmental protective factors, specifically housing. Over in Indianapolis, the Continuum of Care is running a pilot program right now that reallocates housing vouchers. They're specifically doubling rapid exit vouchers from 6 to 12. And you might be wondering, why does this matter to child welfare? Because stabilizing housing is an absolutely critical protective factor. If a non-offending parent in a domestic violence situation has a rapid, safe place to relocate to, they can protect their children. It completely changes the entire dynamic of a DCS assessment, allowing families to actually find safety without the state having to rely purely on punitive substantiations. It's a huge shift. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground in this explainer today, all the way from the rigid digital architecture of magic down to the highly emotional lived reality of the Pearson family. And it really leaves us with this final provocative thought to chew on. How can our bureaucratic systems effectively balance the rigid mathematical mandate to protect children with the incredibly nuanced, messy, daily realities of domestic violence and housing instability? The rules of this administrative game profoundly impact real human lives every single day. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack all of this. Keep asking great questions, and I hope this helped you truly understand the complex world behind the thresholds.